Good morning. A lot of stand up, sit down this morning. Hey, I don't know if you guys have heard, but there is an election coming up. Have you heard about that? Well, we talked about that a couple weeks ago. We're not going to talk specifically about that, but I want to talk to you about an interesting stat that I found out this week. That this stage is tempting to me. It's actually not for us. There's a play going on at the school here next week, but I like to walk on the stairs, and so they took my stairs away. So anyways, the stat that I heard is that 33% of people report broken relationships over political beliefs. 33%. Let me say it this way. Let me make it clear. 33% say they have broken relationships in their families over political beliefs. And if you're a millennial, it's just under 50%. Here's what that reveals to me, is that we have a priorities issue in our nation. My friend Seth was with us in July, and he started talking about this concept that has really intrigued me. He called it identity mapping, okay? And identity mapping is basically you take basically a bullseye and you write on it the things that are most important to you. And at the center should be the things that take priority in your life. I would say this, probably at the very center should be your relationship with God. Put your spouse in there, your kids in there, your parents in there, widen it maybe, throw some cousins and siblings, okay? Now some of you, the Dallas Cowboys land right here, and you're perpetually miserable to be around. I was talking with an extended family member, and he told me this. He said, I have stopped watching football because I found myself all alone on a Saturday at my house yelling at my TV. And he said, this is absolutely ridiculous. This should not get this type of energy from me, this type of emotion from me. The truth is, I think that there are consequences to this upcoming election. If you haven't done the early voting thing, I think you should vote. But I don't think that elections and your political beliefs should be at the bullseye of your identity map. I don't think that you should lose relationships over what your political beliefs are. I think there are very few things that are worth losing relationship with, especially with your family. And here's the sneaky way this thing plays out. I've seen it before, is that somebody is a little bit louder with their beliefs than other people. And so they start barking their beliefs as if they're the only way to live and the only way to believe. And because we live in a culture that has no healthy understanding of conflict, instead of engaging and saying, hey, I don't see it differently, I care more about you than our beliefs, I'd like to change the conversation, we end up getting hurt and isolating, and we'll allow our own pride on both sides of the conflict to keep us from prioritizing relationships. Have you witnessed that? Now, maybe the brokenness that's in your life or around you has nothing to do with politics. That's great, because this is not a message on politics. Maybe it has to do with the way some events happened and some bad text messages, or you said the wrong thing, or you ignored this, or you missed my birthday. It doesn't really matter what the issue is. The fact that we're okay living with broken relationships is incredibly damaging to our lives and the lives of those around us. Think about this. If millennials are saying, if 1 in 2 millennials almost is saying, I have broken relationships because of political beliefs, we're in danger of losing a generation of relationships. Do you understand that? Like, God came to restore the hearts of fathers and mothers to the hearts of sons and daughters. And there is a spirit that we're letting loose in our families that's bringing division and devastation, and it's actually stopping the flow of generational legacy. It's not okay. And it should make our hearts break. Here's the truth about brokenness, is that there are some people that are toxic. And there are some people that you cannot have relationship with. And I believe this, that everybody for your sake is worthy of forgiving, but you may not be able to reconcile with everybody. And that's absolutely okay. Paul writes to one of the churches, he says, so long as it depends on you, live at peace with all people. And so what I'm not saying is that we should do everything to the cost of our own health and the health of our loved ones to reconcile relationships. However, we should prioritize our relationships over things like politics. Are you with me? So I was praying for us this week, and I sensed God just put this phrase in my heart. He said, humility is the way forward. Humility is the way forward. So I want to talk to you not simply about brokenness in relationships, but I think this is where so many of us get stuck in life, whether it's our relationships, maybe it's with a spouse or with your kids or with your parents, or maybe it's in your relationship with God, and maybe just in your position in life, you feel stuck. And I just sense this, that God is saying, humility is the way forward for you. Go with me to Matthew chapter 15. It's kind of a peculiar story for humility. We'll start in verse 21. It says, my subtitle for this is The Faith of the Canaanite Woman. In Mark, she's called the Syro-Phoenician woman. Those two regions are actually interchangeable. Verse 21, leaving that place, Jesus withdrew to the region of Tyre and Sidon. A Canaanite woman from the vicinity came to him, crying out, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is demon-possessed and suffering terribly. Jesus did not answer a word. Have you ever been there in your prayer life? Like, man, Jesus isn't answering a stinking word that I say. There's a key in here. Jesus did not answer a word, so his disciples came to him and urged him, send her away, for she keeps crying out after us. He answered, I was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. The woman came and knelt before him. The Lord help me, she said. He replied, it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. You catch that? If you don't understand what's going here, it sounds like Jesus is racist, doesn't it? Maybe a little bit? Just me, okay. He's not, I promise you. We'll get there in a second. Yes, it is, Lord, she said. Even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table. Then Jesus said to her, woman, you have great faith. Your request is granted. And her daughter was healed at that moment. So the woman comes up and says, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. Here's what you have to understand contextually for this to make sense to you. That phrase was a phrase that was reserved for Jewish people. So the fact that she's saying, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me, she's actually pretending to be Jewish in order to get her way. Here's the truth. God will not bless the fake you. He cannot meet with the fake version of you. He cannot pour out grace on the false version of you. I remember, it's probably 2 or 3 years now, just being in a low spot. My life kind of does this. Does your life kind of do this, right? I remember just being in a low spot, sitting in my regular time with God in the morning thinking, God, I just need you to bless me. Would you just show up and bless me? Probably sat there for about 20 minutes. Nothing happened, so I got up and went on and did the normal thing. That morning I went to the office, though, and I was talking with Lynette, who was our children's pastor at the time, and Lynette was talking about being vulnerable with God. A light bulb went off for me. I wasn't being vulnerable with God. I was just asking God to serve me, to do something for me. That next morning, I sat with God. I said, God, I want you to bless me, but I need you. But here's where I'm not okay. Here's where I'm wrestling. Here's where I'm struggling. Here's where I'm disappointed. As I was vulnerable with God, it was like his presence came rushing in. Another word for vulnerability is humility. As I was open and honest with God about where I was, he flooded into my life and began to take the weight, the pressure, the discouragement that I was feeling and lift that off of me. Why? Could he have done it the day before? Absolutely. But he was more interested in my heart and my connection with him than solving my problem. He wasn't going to bless the fake me, because what that would have done to me is encouraged me to continue to live in a fake world. God's not interested in blessing your mask. He's not interested in you playing religious games, spiritual games, social games, and pouring out blessing on you. James and Peter both say it this way: God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. He resists the proud. How many of you enjoy being resisted by God? None of us, right? And so there's actually a surefire way to find God and to invite God to pour out his grace on you. Now, in the West, we have what I would say is a pretty shallow understanding of the idea of grace. We tend to think of grace as a free gift for the undeserving, but it's way bigger and it's way better than that. The best definition that I could give you of grace is the empowering presence of God that causes me to be who God created me to be and do all that he created me to do. It has nothing to do with my deserving or not, because it's not earned based on merit. It's earned based on relationship. It's inheritance with him. So I'm not striving to get grace. Instead, I'm sharing my life in order to get grace. I'm living open and vulnerable with God, and he pours grace in. What I've found to be true, one, is that the way that I treat others and interact with others says a lot about the way that I interact with God. In fact, we tend to live out our faith in our relationship with others. And so what I've discovered is that as I've learned to live humbly before God, that it empowers me then to live humbly before others. And as I've learned to live humbly before others, it empowers me to live humbly before God. Let me give you a good working definition of humility. Now, a lot of people think humility is to think lowly of oneself. It's actually not what it is. Humility is not that you would be self-deprecating and disparage yourself. It's not that you would put on sackcloth and ashes as they would do in the day and just say, oh, I'm just such a horrible, lowly worm. Biblical definition, when you look at the Hebrew word for humility, is to properly occupy one's place in life. No more, no less. To properly occupy one's place in life, no more, no less. Moses writes about himself in Numbers chapter 12 that he is the most humble man on the face of the earth. That's pretty clever, right? It's like the Apostle John saying, I'm the one that Jesus loved. Well, Moses is like, well, I'm the most humble guy on the face of the earth. Here's why Moses had the authority to write that. Because if humility is to properly occupy one's place in life, Moses had been living that his whole life, or the last third of his life at least. You see, he saw the plagues of God, he saw the Red Sea parted, he saw water from rocks, he saw manna from heaven, he saw pillars of fire and a cloud of, he saw all of this stuff, and he understood this, that he had a role to play in every single one of those, but none of those were because of him. He was properly occupying his place in life, and his place in life was to be the one who sets Israel free from captivity in partnership with God. And he understood that his partnership was like a 1% factor in the whole thing. He simply had to show up and stay connected. That was it. But he understood that none of that would have happened had he not properly occupied that place in life by showing up and allowing God to show off. And so he didn't think so highly of himself as to think that he was the one that was parting the Red Sea, but he also understood that God was looking for a partner, and if he could put his confidence in God and occupy the place in life that God had given him, then he was going to see miracles happen. He wasn't moping around saying, I am just here, just a lowly worm to be used by God. But instead, he understood what God was doing in his life, and he was properly living in the full extent, the full boundaries that God had called him to live in. You know what kept him from seeing the promised land? He stepped out of properly occupying that space. He overreached and he struck a rock when he shouldn't have. And so Jesus is interacting with this Canaanite woman, and she's pretending like the truth is every single one of us have spent some time in our life pretending before God, pretending to the people around us. So she's pretending, and Jesus is calling her on it. He's saying, you're not who you said that you are. You don't actually have the right to call me son of David. Jesus playfully says to her that it's not right to give scraps. Now, here's where our translations miss it. Jesus didn't say it's not right to give scraps to dogs, okay? Jewish people would have called Canaanites dogs, and it was actually incredibly dishonoring to them. What Jesus called her was a little puppy. He was actually being playful in his interaction with her. He wasn't insulting her. And she became playful back. Did you catch that? She says, yes, Lord, and she actually uses the same word, even the little puppies eat the crumbs. It's actually house puppies. Even the house puppies eat crumbs that fall from their master's table. I'd like to suggest this, that one sign of humility inside of relationships is actually the ability to be playful. To not take everything so personally and to be so quickly offended. Are you with me? Like sometimes it's just like, hey, that's crazy Uncle Freddie, and he's absurd. And instead of distancing myself from crazy Uncle Freddie at the upcoming Thanksgiving meal, I'm just going to play with him a little bit. And so what happens to her, because she's willing to acknowledge that she was assuming a place as a son of David like Jesus, she was assuming one that didn't belong to her. As soon as she stepped back into the place that she was meant to occupy, that's called humility, grace begins to flow. Here's another story. Go with me to 2 Kings chapter 5. Verse 1, it says, "Now Naaman was a commander of the army of the king of Aram, and he was a great man in the sight of his master and highly regarded because through him the Lord had given victory to Aram. He was a valiant soldier, but he had leprosy." That's a big but for that guy's life. He's doing really well, but he's got leprosy. Digits are falling off. It's not a great place to be. Now, bands of raiders from Aram had gone out and taken captive a young girl from Israel. She served Naaman's wife. She said to her mistress, "If only my master could see the prophet who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy." Naaman went to his master and told him that what the girl from Israel had said. "By all means go," the king of Aram replied. "I will send a letter to the king of Israel." So Naaman left, taking with him 10 talents of silver, 6,000 shekels of gold, and 10 sets of clothing. Then the letter that he took to the king of Israel read, "With this letter I am sending my servant Naaman to you, so that you may cure him of his leprosy." As soon as the king of Israel read the letter, he tore his clothes and said, "Am I God? Can I kill and bring back to life? Why does this fellow send someone to me to be cured of leprosy? See how he is trying to pick a quarrel with me." When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his robes, he sent him this message: "Why have you torn your robes? Have the man come to me, and he will know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman went with his horses and chariots and stopped at the door of Elisha's house. Elisha sent a messenger to say to him, "Go and wash 7 times in the Jordan, and your flesh will be restored, and you will be cleansed." Sounds like pretty hopeful. But Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in rage. Does that sound like pride to you? Naaman's servants went to him and said, "My father, if the prophet had told you to do some great thing, would you have done it? Would you have not done it? How much more then when he tells you to wash and be cleansed?" So he went down and dipped himself in the Jordan 7 times as the man of God had told him, and his flesh was restored, and he became like that of a young boy. How often are we like that? I think so often we find ourselves saying, God is going to do it this way. And I am deserving of this thing. And I need to have it this way. And our pride begins to push against the ways of God. How many of you know that Jesus rarely healed somebody the same way? He wasn't looking for a formula. He was looking for faith. And faith often looks like submission and obedience. And so what God was doing with Naaman here was saying, hey, would you humble yourself in order to allow me to touch you? You see, humility often looks like submission. It often looks like getting low and coming under. The truth is, if humility means to fully occupy the place in life that God has given you, then that place in life has to fall under submission to God himself. And so I begin to find myself continually, if I'm walking in humility, continually in a place of surrender. Continually saying, God, purify my heart, God. Is there anything off? Is there anything that you're wanting to touch? I was praying this week. I was saying, God, I want to see you move in San Marcos. Now, I have a heart for our whole region, but I was praying specifically for San Marcos. And I said to God, I want to receive San Marcos into your kingdom for you. And here's what he told me. He said, Joel, you can't receive that which you've rejected. I immediately knew what he said. Now, let me say this very clearly. I love San Marcos. I love the people of San Marcos. But I also know where my pride, where my disappointment, where my frustration has crept in. And where, in order to protect myself, there are areas of my life where I was rejecting what God was wanting to give. It's impossible for you to receive what you've rejected. So often we reject things that are close to us in order to protect ourselves from disappointment. So my response was on my porch, in my backyard, just to get down on my knees, begin to say, Jesus, I had no idea that when I was listening to and agreeing with this criticism, I was rejecting what you were wanting to give. I just began to invite God to move, but first I had to humble myself to receive what he wanted to give. So often, the very things that we're asking God for are the very things that we've rejected. We're asking God to move in a certain way, but it's actually, we've judged it before we ever ask God to move that way. We're asking God to bring restoration to a generation, but we've already written that generation off and judged them. And we're saying, God, you go fix that problem. And what God's saying is, I want to pour grace out through you to them, but it's required that you humble yourself. You've got a broken relationship in your family, or a close friend that you won't talk to anymore because something came and brought division in that place. And what God's saying is, hey, if you will humble yourself, and for some of you, you're like, I don't even know why that thing broke. Like, I don't know what happened in that relationship. And you're trying to figure out, what is it that I need to fix? And where was I wrong? And what needs to happen? This, and this. And, well, you know, they did this, and they said this. And maybe what it looks like is saying, you know what? I'm sorry that thing fell apart. I don't even know what happened. And I'll listen to you tell me what I've done to break your trust or to offend you, but I'm willing to do whatever I can in order to make it right, because you're way more important than my own pride. You're way more important than me being right. Here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that you should surrender your God-given conviction in order to please people. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is that you would allow your love for people to speak louder than your inferior belief systems. Are you with me? And I believe this, that the division that we see in our families, even in our marriages, the divisions that we see with our friends, the division that we see in our nation and between nations, so much of that is being protected by this incredibly demonic thing called pride. That pride is killing us. It's devastating our families, and it's devastating the church. And if we would be willing to humble ourselves, then I believe that we can find a way forward. Now, you may think, I'm not the arrogant sort of person, so surely pride doesn't apply to me. Let me give you a few definitions of pride, just to help you find some humility. One definition of pride simply is self-reliance and independence from God. Have you ever lived that way? Here's one of the ways that sneaks in. Y'all, I'm really good at this one. One of the ways that sneaks in is to try to do things for God instead of with God. We're trying to prove to God that we're worthy of blessing instead of humbling ourselves and saying, God, I'd really like to do this with you. I think you'd like to do it with me. Let's partner up. I'll submit to your ways. I'll come under you. I'll go low and I'll watch you move, but I want to do it with you. Now, the truth is, that type of pride doesn't simply mess with us with God, it also breaks our relationships. I've taught several times on the damage self-reliance does, and I'll just use a phrase that my friend told me. He said, Joel, if you don't let me serve you, then you don't let me love you. And my self-reliance was keeping one of my closest friends from coming alongside me and serving me. And what he was saying is that your self-reliance has become a wall in our relationship, and we can't go any further, we can't be any closer because you're protecting, saying, I don't need anybody. So pride isn't simply arrogance, although pride often does look like arrogant self-exaltation. Pride isn't thinking, or humility isn't thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less, right? So in the same way, pride, it's not about simply thinking, the damage it does is because you think of yourself more, not just thinking more of yourself than others. And so the way that we get preoccupied with ourselves and then exalting ourselves, it begins to do damage inside of our relationships. And so in pride, we're always attempting to make ourselves look better than others. Here's a sneaky form of arrogant pride: being a know-it-all. Using every opportunity when somebody is struggling or trying to figure something out to show them that you know more than them. Now, what I'm not saying is when people are struggling, don't come alongside them and help them. But there's a big difference. There's one that says, hey, I'm here to serve you. And the other is, I'm here to be your hero. until I'm a know-it-all, similarly being a story topper. And I know that feeling. I used to story top all the time, honestly. I was really good at it. I was better at it than you. No, I've seen like that thought pattern where it's like somebody's telling a story and you get excited about like sharing your story, but then the sneaky pride thing comes in and you begin to share how much better your experience was than theirs, instead of humbly celebrating them and saying, hey, I'm not even going to bring up my great victories. Does that make sense? Here's the third one. This is maybe the sneakiest one of them all. False humility. False humility is actually a form of pride. It has the appearance of humility without the surrendered will. The appearance of humility without the surrendered will. And so that form of humility is like, oh, I'm not that great. I'll let you in, but it doesn't allow, like in our relationship with God. It's like that false humility thing will make you like Martha instead of like Mary. Let me tell you the story. Jesus was in the house of Mary and Martha, and he was doing some talking to people in the room, and there was a meal that needed to be cooked and things that needed to be cleaned, and Martha, Mary's sister, is running around getting everything set up. Mary is sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening to the great rabbi teach. Martha busied herself instead of surrendering to what Jesus was doing in that moment. And she thought that her doing for God, which can so often be full of false humility, was more important than being with God. And we can so often serve ourselves or serve others so that if we find ourselves missing out on the grace of God. What I'm not talking about is not serving others. We should serve others. But when we do it, not from overflow, but in order to find fulfillment, what we find is that we're trying to earn something that was meant to come for free. And so often, false humility looks like putting on all of the performance that humility would without surrendering our will. In that story with Mary and Martha, what Martha needed to do is say, hey, I'm not trying to prove anything to you, Jesus. I'm actually just going to humble myself and sit at your feet and receive from you. Go with me finally as we close to Philippians chapter 2. Paul, writing to the church at Philippi, says, therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, any comfort from his love, any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete by being like-minded. Check this out. Having the same love and being one in the Spirit and of the same mind, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself, not looking to your own interests, but each one of you to the interest of others. Now that's easy to do when it goes with getting stuff done. Like if you think about it in a family, it's like, oh yeah, well I'll just do the dishes or do the laundry or sweep the floors or whatever, take out the trash. It's like, but what about when it goes deeper and seeps into our relationships? Are we willing to humble ourselves and serve others? Make ourselves low and consider others better than ourselves. And even one of the most sacred things to all of us is the places where we've been wounded. And what does it look like to begin to trust others where you've been wounded and acknowledge where they've been wounded? Here's what I mean. Most of the time, when a husband and wife are fighting, it's 1% the wife's fault and 99% the husband's fault. Just kidding. It's usually pretty close to 50-50. The husband tends to do something he didn't know that he did wrong, and it all spirals and gets messy from there. But usually it's 50-50. But what we often do in that place of 50-50 is I say, but you hurt me here. And I hold that thing sacred, and I say the places where you've been hurt aren't as sacred. And so I'm not willing to address the place where I've been hurt until you do, and I'm not willing to address the place that you've been hurt, but instead I'm wanting you to fix what you've done wrong. Jesus tells a story about that. He says, why do you look at the speck in your neighbor's eye when you have a plank sticking out of your eye? He says, first, take care of the plank in your eye, and then, so it's not disqualifying, it's just order, and then worry about the speck in your neighbor's eye. Here's the point of that. That's not saying get all the attention for the pain in your eye. What it's saying is the place of your brokenness address first, and that's what humility does. Humility says, I have a plank in my eye. I was wrong because I let this thing get in the way of our relationship, and I let it do damage to you, and I'm sorry. So before you're ever looking for someone else to humble themselves and come towards you, before you say, you really hurt me, and if you would just fix this thing, then I would be okay. Before you ever do that, you look for your 50% or your 1% or your 99%, and you say, this is the place where I've been incredibly wrong. And I'm sorry that I wounded you. And what you'll find is that in the same way that Naaman being willing to go to the river and wash, not because he wanted to, but because he began to trust and he laid down his pride, what you'll find is that in your relationships, people will begin to say, okay, if he cares more about me than his pain, then he's going to be willing to hear me out and to care for me. And what most people want in broken relationships is to know that they're safe. And if you're willing to secure the people that you have broken relationships with by saying, you know what, I was wrong. Maybe you were wrong in how you acted, or maybe you were wrong in how you reacted. But if you can begin to say, you know what, I'm going to build a bridge of trust through humility that'll bring restoration, then what you'll find is that grace begins to flow. Grace from heaven flows because you've been humble. Grace will begin to flow from those relationships most of the time, not all of the time. But what we'll find is that in our humility, God will make a way. As I've been talking, some of you have been wrestling with places where your pride has done damage in relationships. I think the starting place for reconciliation is humility before God. It's to say, God, I don't know what to do here, but this area I'm going to surrender to you and submit to you that you would have your way. And as you do that, that means walking it out however he would call you to. But I believe this, church, that God is calling us to lay down every bit of our pride so that his grace can freely flow in our midst. Would you stand with me? I'm going to invite our ministry team. This stage is taking up a little bit of our space, but they're going to be in the wings here. And if you would like for somebody to pray with you, these folks would love to pray with you. Maybe you're here and you want to surrender your life to Jesus. You've never said, Jesus, I just trust you with my whole life. I'm submitting to you and to your ways. This morning would be an incredible opportunity to do that. These folks would love to pray with you. Maybe you've got sickness in your body or you're wrestling with something and you need some breakthrough. These folks would love to join you in prayer. But maybe this morning you're wrestling with pride. Maybe before you go up to receive prayer from anybody, maybe what you need to do is find a little space to get on your knees before God and just begin to confess and let him meet you in that place of pride and that place of brokenness so that grace can begin to flow. Jesus, my prayer for us is that we, Sozo Church, would be a people that walk full of humility. And so, Lord, we open up our lives and our heart to you. And Lord, we ask that you would have your way. That you would move in us, that you would tenderize our hearts to the things that you're tender to. Lord, we ask for breakthrough where there's brokenness in our relationships. And Lord, we ask that you would use us to be a people who bring healing, to be ministers of reconciliation, that your grace would flow and your kingdom would come. In Jesus' name, amen.